The mountain man's mail-order bride arrived, but the secret she carried saved his life. The wind howled through the Wyoming wilderness like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter. Elias Thornwood stood at the edge of his cabin's small porch, watching snow clouds gather over the distant peaks. His chest tightened, not from the cold, but from the familiar ache that had become his constant companion these past 3 years. He pressed a weathered hand against his sternum, feeling the irregular rhythm beneath. The scar tissue from a Blackfoot arrow ran from collarbone to ribs, a souvenir from his days as a trail guide. His left arm, mangled by a grizzly in '07, hung slightly crooked at his side. Both wounds had healed poorly during a winter spent alone in a cave, and now they conspired to steal his breath whenever the temperature dropped. "If you keep living like this, you won't survive 2 more winters." The military doctor's words echoed in his memory, spoken with the clinical detachment of a man who'd seen too many frontier deaths to feel much about another one coming. Elias had nodded at the time, accepting the verdict as he'd accepted every other hardship the mountains had thrown at him. What was one more death sentence in a life full of narrow escapes? He was 34 years old and felt 60. Most men like him didn't make it past 40 anyway. He turned back toward his cabin, a sturdy structure he'd built with his own hands 7 years ago. The logs were tight, the roof solid, the walls thick enough to keep out the worst of the winter winds. Inside, however, was another matter. The single room was cramped and cluttered, filled with the accumulated debris of years lived alone. His sleeping pallet lay too close to the stone fireplace, where smoke often backed up when the wind shifted. A single small window, barely 18 inches square, let in what little light penetrated the surrounding pines. It was a place built for survival, not comfort, and certainly not for 2 people. Elias coughed, a deep rattling sound that bent him double. When it passed, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and saw the familiar pink tinge of blood on his knuckles. He'd learned not to look too closely at such things. The letter sat on his makeshift table, folded and refolded so many times the paper had worn soft as cloth. He'd written it 6 months ago during a moment of weakness, or perhaps clarity. He still wasn't sure which. The traders at Fort William had suggested it half-jokingly after finding him passed out in the snow outside the trading post. "You need someone up there with you, Eli," old Marcus had said, his voice gruff with concern. "A wife. Someone to keep you alive when you can't do it yourself." "I'm no good with people," Elias had protested, the words scraping out of his damaged throat. "You don't need to be good with people. You just need to be not dead. There's services now, mail-order brides they call them. Women back east looking to get out of the cities. Men out here needing wives. You write a letter, they match you up, simple as trading pelts." It had taken Elias another month to actually write the letter, and when he did, the words came out all wrong. He'd crossed out line after line, trying to sound like the kind of man a woman might want to marry. In the end, he'd given up on pretense and written the truth. "I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking for someone who can stand to look at mountains in silence. Someone who won't mind that I am not much for talking and less for town gatherings. I have a cabin that keeps out the weather and enough game to see 2 through winter. I'm not a cruel man, but I am a damaged one. If you are the sort who doesn't need words every day and can abide a man who coughs more than he speaks, then perhaps we might manage together. I mostly just do not want to die alone this winter." The pastor at Fort William had read it, raised an eyebrow, and said nothing. 3 weeks later, word came back. A woman had accepted. Her name was Ada Whitmore, and she was coming from Philadelphia. 300 miles to the east, Ada stood in the cramped room she shared with 2 other seamstresses, reading the letter for perhaps the 100th time. The paper was crisp and new, unlike Elias's well-worn original, but the words were the same, copied out in the pastor's neat hand. She traced the sentences with one finger, her touch gentle despite the calluses earned from years of needlework. "I mostly just do not want to die alone this winter." Those words had seized something in her chest the first time she'd read them. Not romance, not excitement, but recognition. She knew that particular species of loneliness, the kind that came from being seen as less than human. Ada was what polite society called heavy-set, and what her former employer, Mrs. Haversham, had called grotesque. At 26 years old, she stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed considerably more than the fashion plates deemed acceptable. Her dresses had to be let out repeatedly, and no matter how carefully she stitched them, they never hung quite right on her frame. "You make the clothes look cheap," Mrs. Havisham had said the day she dismissed Ada. "Customers come in, see you wearing one of our designs, and suddenly they don't want it anymore. You're bad for business." The other seamstresses had said nothing in Ada's defense. They'd watched in silence as she gathered her few belongings and left the shop where she'd worked for 4 years. She'd found the letter by accident, really, or perhaps by providence. Ada wasn't sure she believed in such things anymore, but the timing had been remarkable. She'd gone to the church looking for work, any work, and the pastor had been sorting through correspondence for various aid societies and charitable organizations. One letter had slipped from his desk, and Ada had picked it up. "Oh, that's for the Bride Bureau," the pastor had said absently. "Poor fellow up in Wyoming territory, practically writing his own obituary. Needs someone to transcribe it properly before I send it on. My hand's been shaking something terrible lately." "Don't suppose you write a clear hand?" Ada did. She'd copied the letter out carefully, and with each word she'd felt something shift inside her. Here was a man who didn't promise wealth or comfort or even happiness. He promised only honesty in mountains and silence. He was damaged, he said, and didn't want to die alone. Ada understood both sentiments intimately. Her own health had been failing for over a year. The doctor she'd seen, paying with money she couldn't afford to spend, had diagnosed a weak heart, prone to palpitations and constriction. "You must avoid exertion," he'd said, "and you must leave the city. The air here, all the coal smoke and factory fumes, it's poison to someone with your constitution." "I can't afford to leave," she'd told him. "Then you can't afford to live much longer either," he'd replied with the same clinical detachment she'd grown used to from medical professionals. But Ada had one advantage that most dying people didn't. She'd spent the last year living in the same boarding house as Dr. James Morrison, a young physician fresh from medical school who couldn't afford proper lodgings. In exchange for helping him with laundry, cleaning, and organizing his chaotic rooms, he'd let her observe his work, read his medical books, and ask questions. "You've got a natural aptitude," he'd told her once. "If you were a man, I'd say go to medical school." "If I were a man, I'd have better things to do than laundry," she'd replied, and they'd both laughed. But she'd learned. Oh, how she'd learned. She knew about respiratory ailments, about how to position someone in distress to open their airways, about which herbs helped with breathing and which were merely superstition. She knew how to recognize the signs of oxygen deprivation, how to perform chest percussion to loosen congestion, how to create steam tents to ease labored breathing. She knew, in short, how to keep someone with damaged lungs alive through a harsh winter. When she'd written back to accept Elias's proposal, she hadn't mentioned her weight or her health problems. She'd written about her skills, sewing, cooking, nursing the elderly, and about her willingness to live in isolation. She hadn't lied exactly. She'd simply omitted the parts that would have made him refuse her. And now, 2 months later, she was on a wagon heading west, carrying one small trunk of belongings and a leather satchel full of medical supplies she'd carefully accumulated, dried herbs, clean bandages, a few precious glass bottles of tinctures Dr. Morrison had given her as a parting gift. "You're going to need these more than I will," he'd said. "And Ada, don't let them make you small out there. You know things that could save lives. Use that knowledge." She'd promised she would. The town of Fort William in late October was a study in brown and gray. Mud-churned streets, weathered wooden buildings, and a sky perpetually threatening snow. Ada climbed down from the wagon that had brought her the last 50 miles from the nearest railroad terminus, her legs shaking from days of travel. The stairs began immediately. She'd expected them, of course. She'd lived with stairs her whole life. But here on the frontier, they had a different quality, more open, less pretense at politeness. Men stopped mid-conversation to watch her pass. Women whispered behind their hands. "That can't be the mail-order bride for Thornwood," someone said, not bothering to lower their voice. "Must be. Who else would come out here looking like that? Poor bastard. Wonder if he knows what he's getting." Ada kept her head up and her face neutral, a skill perfected over years of practice. She'd arranged to meet Elias at the boarding house attached to the trading post. He was supposed to have arrived yesterday, but the proprietor, a weathered woman named Martha, said he hadn't shown up yet. "Storm probably delayed him," Martha said, though her eyes were sympathetic. "Or maybe he changed his mind." "He'll come," Ada said with more confidence than she felt. She was right. Elias arrived the next morning, riding a mule that looked as exhausted as he did. Ada watched from the boarding house window as he dismounted slowly, one hand pressed against his ribs. Even from a distance, she could see the grayish pallor of his skin, the way he moved, like every breath hurt. He's dying, she thought with a clinical clarity that surprised her. Slowly, but definitely dying. The thought didn't frighten her. If anything, it steadied her. This wasn't about romance or even companionship, not really. This was about two people who understood mortality trying to survive one more winter. When Elias entered the boarding house, the small crowd that had gathered fell silent. Ada stood from her chair by the fire, smoothing down her dress, the best one she owned, carefully mended and pressed despite the long journey. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Elias saw a woman larger than he'd imagined, with brown hair pulled back severely and eyes that held neither apology nor defiance. Just a steady, measuring gaze that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Ada saw a man thinner than any mountain man had a right to be, with gray threaded through his dark hair and lines of pain etched around his mouth. His eyes, though. His eyes were clear and direct, the eyes of someone who'd learned to see what mattered. Neither of them looked like what the other had imagined, and somehow that made it better. Ada stepped forward first, extending her hand. "I read your letter many times," she said quietly. "I'm also afraid of dying alone this winter." Elias took her hand. Her grip was stronger than he'd expected, and nodded. "Then I suppose we'd best help each other survive it." Behind them, someone snorted with laughter. "This'll be entertaining." Elias didn't turn around, but Ada felt his hand tighten briefly on hers before releasing it. A promise, perhaps, or a warning to others. They were married that afternoon by the fort's chaplain, a quick ceremony with Martha and the trading post owner as witnesses. No celebration, no well wishes from the gathered townspeople, just a simple exchange of vows and a notation in the chaplain's record book. As they left the post to head up to Elias's cabin, Ada heard the whispers following them. "Give it till January. She'll eat him out of house and home. Or he'll send her back. Poor thing came all this way for nothing. My money's on them both freezing to death before spring." Ada said nothing, but she noticed Elias's jaw tighten. She also noticed how his breathing had grown more labored during the ceremony, how he'd had to suppress coughs throughout the vows. The ride up to the cabin took 6 hours, following a narrow trail that wound through dense pine forest and across rushing streams. Ada rode behind Elias on the mule, her arms around his waist to steady herself, and she could feel the irregular rhythm of his breathing, the way his ribs expanded and contracted with effort. By the time they reached the cabin, full darkness had fallen. Elias lit a lantern and pushed open the door, gesturing for Ada to enter first. The smell hit her immediately. Smoke, old grease, unwashed clothes, and underneath it all, the distinctive musty scent of poor ventilation. The single room was exactly as he'd described, sturdy, weatherproof, and utterly unsuited for someone with respiratory problems. "It's not much," Elias said, his voice rough. "But it's—" He didn't finish the sentence. A coughing fit seized him, bending him double. Ada watched as he braced himself against the doorframe, his whole body shaking with the force of it. When it finally subsided, there was blood on his hand. "Sit down," Ada said, her voice calm but firm. She guided him to the single chair near the fireplace, noting how the smoke from the banked fire was already making her own eyes water. "Don't talk, just breathe slowly." She moved around the cabin with quick efficiency, her trained eye cataloging everything. The fireplace was poorly ventilated, built too close to the sleeping area. The single window was too small and positioned wrong for proper air circulation. The stored food, the hanging furs, the clutter of tools, all of it contributed to an atmosphere that was slowly suffocating him. This cabin was a death trap, but it didn't have to be. The first week was a careful dance of adjustment and assessment. Ada said little about the changes she planned, focusing instead on learning the rhythms of Elias's condition. She noted how the coughing worsened at night when he lay down, how certain activities, chopping wood, carrying water, left him gasping, how the morning fires filled the cabin with smoke that lingered for hours. She also learned that Elias, for all his gruffness, was not cruel. He'd given her the sleeping pallet and made himself a bed of furs near the door. He didn't expect her to cook elaborate meals or maintain impossible standards of housekeeping. He seemed, in fact, slightly confused about what to expect from a wife at all. "I've never been married," he admitted one evening as they ate a simple dinner of rabbit stew and cornbread. "Don't know the protocols." "Neither have I," Ada replied. "I suppose we'll figure it out as we go." What she didn't say was that she was too busy keeping him alive to worry much about protocol. On the 8th day, Elias announced they needed to go down to the trading post for supplies. The journey down was easier than the journey up, but by the time they reached Fort William, Ada could see how the exertion had cost him. His lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and his breathing had grown shallow and rapid. Inside the trading post, the whispers started immediately. Ada ignored them, focusing on the supplies they needed: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. But she also quietly purchased several items from her own small store of coins: beeswax, linen cloth, a small pot of pine tar, and several bundles of dried herbs that the proprietor's wife kept for women's ailments. "What do you need all that for?" the woman asked suspiciously. "Mending," Ada replied simply. At the counter, as Elias settled the account, a man Ada didn't recognize sidled up to him. "Saw your bride, Thornwood. You get what you paid for?" Elias didn't respond, his attention fixed on counting out coins. The man persisted, his voice carrying across the store. "I mean, they say you sent for a wife, but looks like you got a burden instead. How's she going to manage up there? Must eat you out of supplies by Christmas." Several people laughed. Ada felt the familiar burn of shame in her cheeks but kept her expression neutral. She'd heard worse, but Elias set down the coins with deliberate care and turned to face the man. "You know what else I've noticed?" he said, his damaged voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying. "That my wife doesn't talk much. Makes her better company than most folks in this town." The laughter died. The man's face reddened. "She also," Elias continued, "doesn't make me cough until I pass out, which is more than I can say for this cabin's chimney. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do before winter sets in properly." He picked up their supplies and walked out. Ada followed, her heart beating hard against her ribs, though whether from his defense of her or her concern for his breathing, she couldn't quite say. On the ride back up to the cabin, Elias had to stop 3 times to rest. The last time, he actually slid off the mule and sat heavily on a fallen log, his head in his hands. "I can't breathe," he gasped. "Can't get enough." Ada was off the mule in an instant. She'd been preparing for this moment since their first night together, watching and waiting for the inevitable crisis. Now it was here, and she moved with the calm precision Dr. Morrison had always praised. "Look at me," she commanded. "Elias, look at me." His eyes, panicked and unfocused, found hers. "You're not dying right now," she said firmly. "Your lungs are constricted and full of fluid, but you're getting enough air to stay conscious, which means we can work with this. I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" He nodded, barely. "Good. Now I'm going to help you breathe better, but it's going to feel strange. Don't fight me." She positioned herself behind him and wrapped her arms around his ribcage, placing her hands flat against his sternum. Then, timing her movements to his breathing, she began to apply pressure, gentle but firm compressions that helped expand his lungs more fully. "Breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth," she instructed. "Slowly. Don't try to take big breaths, small ones, steady ones." She kept up the compressions, feeling his breathing gradually slow and deepen. After several minutes, the bluish tint began to fade from his lips. After 10 minutes, he was breathing almost normally. "How?" he began when he could finally speak. "How did you know to do that?" "I'll explain later," Ada said. "Right now we need to get you back to the cabin. Can you ride?" He could, barely. Ada walked alongside the mule this time, her hand on Elias's leg to steady him, ready to catch him if he started to fall. That night, after getting him settled and making sure his breathing had stabilized, Ada stood in the center of the cabin and made a decision. She couldn't wait any longer to implement the changes she'd been planning. If she did, Elias wouldn't survive the winter. "I need to make some modifications," she said. Elias, lying on the sleeping pallet, looked at her warily. "What kind of modifications?" "The kind that will keep you alive," she gestured around the cabin. "This place is killing you as surely as that arrow wound or the grizzly attack. The smoke, the poor ventilation, the way everything is arranged, it's all wrong for someone with damaged lungs." "I built this cabin with my own hands," Elias said. and there was an edge of defensiveness in his voice. "I know, and you built it well, for a healthy man. But you're not healthy anymore, and if you keep living like this, you'll be dead before spring." She paused, then added more softly, "I didn't come all this way to watch you die of stubbornness." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he laughed. A short, painful sound, but genuine. "Fair enough. What do you need me to do?" "Rest," Ada said. "Let me work." Over the next 3 weeks, Ada transformed the cabin. Working with a determination born of desperation and knowledge, she implemented every technique she'd learned from Dr. Morrison about creating healthy living spaces for respiratory patients. First, she tackled the fireplace. Using the pine tar and clay from a nearby stream bank, she relined the chimney to improve the draft. She built a simple baffle system that directed smoke more efficiently up and out rather than letting it pool in the cabin. She moved the cooking area farther from the sleeping space and created a venting system using hollowed logs positioned to draw fresh air in while pushing stale air out. Next came the window. Using tools from Elias's workshop, she carefully enlarged the opening, then fashioned a second smaller window on the opposite wall to create cross-ventilation. She made shutters that could be adjusted to control airflow without completely blocking light or warmth. She reorganized the entire interior, separating the sleeping area from the working area with a hanging curtain made from one of her spare dresses. She raised Elias's sleeping platform higher off the ground, knowing that cold, damp air settled low. She created a system of hooks and shelves to get stored food and furs up off the floor and away from the sleeping area. Every change had a purpose. Every modification was designed to give Elias's damaged lungs the best possible chance of healing. Elias watched her work with something approaching awe. When he tried to help, she assigned him only tasks that wouldn't strain his breathing, sorting supplies, mending leather, planning trap lines for when he was well enough to run them again. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked one evening as they sat eating dinner in a cabin that now smelled of fresh pine and clean air rather than smoke and stagnation. Ada hesitated. She'd kept her secrets close for so long that honesty felt dangerous. But looking at Elias's face in the lamplight, open, curious, without judgment, she found herself telling the truth. "In Philadelphia, I lived in a boarding house with a young doctor. I helped him with chores in exchange for learning. He had books about respiratory ailments, about the lungs and how they worked. I read them all." She paused, then added, "I also read about heart conditions, because I have one." Elias set down his spoon. "You're sick too?" "My heart is weak. The doctor said the city air was killing me, that I needed to leave or I wouldn't see 30. She met his eyes directly. "I didn't tell you because I thought if you knew, you wouldn't accept me. And I thought maybe we could keep each other alive. 2 damaged people might manage better than 1. Silence fell between them. Ada braced herself for anger, for accusations of deception. She wouldn't have blamed him. Instead, Elias began to laugh, really laugh, deep and genuine, despite the way it made him cough afterward. "So we're both dying," he said when he caught his breath. "And we both lied by omission. That's either the worst match ever made or the best one. Which do you think it is?" Ada asked quietly. "Ask me in the spring," Elias replied, "if we're both still here." Winter arrived in earnest in mid-November, sweeping down from the mountains with howling winds and heavy snow. But inside the modified cabin, Elias and Ada weathered it in relative comfort. The new ventilation system worked brilliantly. Fresh air circulated constantly without creating drafts. The improved fireplace provided steady heat without filling the room with smoke. The raised sleeping platform kept them dry and warm. More importantly, Elias's health began to stabilize. The constant coughing that had plagued him for years diminished to occasional bouts. His color improved. He could complete simple tasks without gasping for air. Ada, meanwhile, found that her own health benefited from the clean mountain air and regular meals. The palpitations that had frightened her in Philadelphia became less frequent. She could work for hours without the crushing exhaustion that had been her constant companion. They developed a routine that suited them both. Elias checked his trap lines on good weather days, never pushing himself too far. Ada managed the cabin, tended their small store of supplies, and continued learning about the wilderness around them. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes reading from the 2 books Ada had brought with her, sometimes simply existing in comfortable silence. It wasn't romance, not in any traditional sense, but it was partnership, built on mutual respect and shared understanding. They were 2 people who'd been broken by different circumstances, finding in each other not salvation, but the possibility of survival. The crisis came in January, during the worst storm of the winter. Elias had been out checking his nearest trapline when the blizzard hit, coming on so suddenly that he was caught 2 miles from the cabin. He made it back through sheer determination, but by the time he stumbled through the door, he was hypothermic and struggling to breathe. Ada had been preparing for exactly this scenario. She had a system ready: hot water bottles, dry clothes, heated blankets. She stripped off his frozen outer layers, wrapped him in wool, and positioned him near the fire but not too close. She made him drink warm broth in small sips, but his breathing kept deteriorating. The cold had triggered a massive constriction in his damaged lungs. His lips turned blue, his chest heaved with the effort of drawing breath. This was it. The moment Ada had been both dreading and preparing for. Everything she'd learned, every technique Dr. Morrison had taught her, every modification she'd made to the cabin, it all came down to this. She positioned Elias sitting upright, his back against the wall, pillows supporting him. She created a steam tent using a pot of boiling water infused with pine needles and herbs, draping a blanket over his head in the pot to force him to breathe the medicated vapor. She performed chest percussion, using her hands to gently but firmly strike his back in specific patterns designed to loosen the fluid in his lungs. She had him cough into a bowl, clearing the congestion that was drowning him from the inside. For 3 hours, Ada worked without stopping. Her own heart pounded irregularly in her chest. Her hands shook from fatigue, but she didn't pause. She couldn't. If she stopped, Elias would die. And sometime during those long hours, she realized something that terrified her more than his death. She didn't want to lose him. Not because she needed him to survive the winter, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because he'd become important to her. Because they'd built something together in this isolated cabin, something fragile but real. Finally, near midnight, Elias's breathing began to ease. The color returned to his face. His eyes, which had been glassy with oxygen deprivation, cleared and focused on her. "Ada," he whispered, you saved my life." She slumped against the wall beside him, exhausted. "Yes." "Why?" It wasn't suspicion in his voice, just genuine curiosity. Why go to such lengths for someone you barely know? Ada considered the question. A month ago, she might have said it was because she needed him to survive, or because she owed him for taking her in. But now, sitting in the warm cabin they'd created together, she found herself telling another truth. Because you were the first person who looked at me and didn't see a burden. You saw someone who might understand silence and mountains. And because, she paused, then continued softly, because I think we're building something here. Something worth saving. Elias reached out and took her hand, the first deliberately affectionate gesture either of them had made. His grip was weak but steady. "Then I suppose we'd better both keep living. Be ashamed to waste all this effort." Despite everything, the exhaustion, the fear, the uncertainty, Ada smiled. Word of Elias's recovery reached Fort William by late February, carried down by a trapper who'd stopped at the cabin looking for shelter during a storm. He'd arrived expecting to find one living tenant at best, both dead at worst. Instead, he'd found both of them alive and relatively well, the cabin transformed, Elias breathing more easily than anyone had seen in years. The story spread quickly through the small frontier community, but not everyone believed it. "Probably just got lucky," said one of the men who'd mocked Ada when she arrived. "Winter wasn't as hard as usual." "I heard she's some kind of witch," another suggested, "using mountain magic or Indian herbs." But the truth came out in March, when disaster struck the settlement itself. A fire broke out in the fort stable, likely started by an overturned lantern. The building was full of horses and hay, a deadly combination. Smoke filled the enclosed space within minutes, trapping both animals and the 2 men who'd been working inside. Ada and Elias had come down that day to trade pelts. When the alarm went up, Elias started toward the burning building, but Ada grabbed his arm. "No, your lungs can't handle smoke. Let me." Before anyone could stop her, she wrapped a wet cloth around her face, took a deep breath of clean air, and ran into the stable. She moved with absolute confidence, calling out instructions as she went. Open the back doors, create cross-ventilation, get the horses to low ground, smoke rises. She found the two men collapsed near the rear of the building, overcome by smoke. Working with swift efficiency, she dragged them toward the fresh air she'd created by opening multiple doors, creating a wind tunnel that pulled smoke away from the floor level. She positioned them on their sides, checked their airways, began chest compressions on one who'd stopped breathing. By the time the fort's doctor arrived, both men were breathing again. The horses had been let out safely. The fire, deprived of oxygen by Ada's strategic opening and closing of doors, had burned itself out without spreading. The crowd that had gathered stared at Ada in stunned silence as she stood there, smoke-stained and breathing hard, her considerable frame heaving with exertion. Fort William's doctor, the same one who'd told Elias he had 2 winners left, walked slowly to where Ada stood. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned to address the crowd. "This woman," he said clearly, "just demonstrated more knowledge of respiratory medicine than anyone in this settlement, including myself. If I had to guess, I'd say she also knows more about general nursing and emergency medicine than most of the certified doctors I trained with." He turned back to Ada. "Where did you learn all this?" "Philadelphia," Ada said simply, "from a doctor who needed help with laundry." "And you applied this knowledge to Elias Thornwood's condition?" "Yes." The doctor nodded slowly. "Then I owe you an apology, and so does this entire settlement. We judged you by your appearance and nearly cost us the knowledge that could save lives." He raised his voice. "Including mine, as it happens. My lungs have been deteriorating from years of smoke exposure during the war. I'd be obliged, Mrs. Thornwood, if you'd teach me what you know." Spring came late to Wyoming that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a kind of transformation. The snow melted from the valleys, revealing new grass underneath. Birds returned to the pines around Elias and Ada's cabin, and slowly, grudgingly, the people of Fort William began to change their opinions. Women who'd whispered cruel things about Ada now came to her with questions about sick children, about husbands who coughed too much, about elderly parents struggling to breathe. Ada treated each request with the same calm competence she'd shown in the stable fire, never mentioning the insults she'd endured. Elias, meanwhile, had regained enough strength to return to his trap lines, though he was careful never to push himself too hard. His breathing would never be perfect, but it was manageable now. More importantly, he'd learned to listen to his body's limits and to trust Ada's judgment about his health. Their relationship had evolved too. It would never be a conventional marriage. There was no great declaration of love, no dramatic romantic gestures, but there was trust and companionship and a deep mutual respect. They'd saved each other, in ways both literal and metaphorical. On a warm evening in May, they sat outside their cabin watching the sun set over the mountains. Elias's breathing was steady, his color good. Ada's heart beat regularly in her chest, strong and sure. "Do you ever regret it?" Elias asked. "Coming out here, marrying a stranger?" Ada considered the question. She thought about the life she'd left behind, the cramped boarding house, the mockery, the suffocating air of the city. She thought about the journey west, the fear and uncertainty, the gamble she'd taken on a man she'd never met. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it. Do you?" "No." Elias paused, then added with the hint of a smile, "Though I do think the matchmaking service should have mentioned you were bossy about cabin ventilation." Ada laughed, a full, genuine sound that rang through the clearing. "And they should have mentioned you were stubborn about asking for help." "Fair enough." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, two people who'd found in each other not perfection, but something perhaps more valuable, the possibility of survival and the unexpected gift of understanding. In town, the stories had taken on a new character. No longer were people betting on when the marriage would fail. Instead, they told different tales, about the mail-order bride who knew medicine, about the mountain man who'd learned to listen, about 2 damaged people who'd figured out how to keep each other alive. "She's not just a mail-order bride," Martha from the boarding house was known to say when newcomers asked about Ada. "She's the reason that man up on the mountain is still standing. And she saved more lives in this settlement than any of us deserve, considering how we treated her. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would be more hard winters, more health crises, more challenges to face, but they would face them together, armed with knowledge and stubbornness and something that felt remarkably like belonging. The secret Ada had carried from Philadelphia, the medical knowledge gleaned from hours of careful observation and study, had indeed saved Elias's life. But in the process, it had done something else. It had given her own life purpose and meaning. She was no longer just the fat girl from the city who'd failed to meet society's standards. She was Ada Thornwood, healer and survivor, partner and friend. And in the mountains of Wyoming territory, in a cabin modified for health and built on mutual respect, that was more than enough.